No police, no neighbors, no backup. Out on the frontier, when darkness fell across the wilderness, families faced their most vulnerable hours. The night brought predators, both animal and human, that could kill an entire family before dawn. Bears could tear through cabin walls. Wolves could surround a homestead for hours. Raiders could strike without warning, taking everything a family had worked years to build. They needed protection systems that worked when they were asleep and defenseless. They needed early warning methods that could detect threats before they reached the cabin. They needed defensive techniques that could stop attackers using only primitive weapons and homemade barriers. Every precaution mattered. One failed security measure, one moment of carelessness, one night without proper protection, and a family could wake up to find their livestock slaughtered, their supplies stolen, or worse, they might not wake up at all. The frontier families who survived in the most dangerous territories had developed protection systems that were more sophisticated and effective than many modern security methods. Defensive techniques that could detect, deter, and defeat threats using only traditional materials and ancestral knowledge. But how did frontier families create early warning systems that could detect threats in complete darkness? Which forgotten defensive techniques could stop armed raiders and dangerous predators? How did they build barriers and fortifications using only hand tools and local materials? And what protection methods were so effective that they kept families safe for generations in the most lawless territories? Today, we're exploring the ingenious protection methods that kept frontier families alive through the dangerous hours of darkness. Security systems that meant the difference between seeing another sunrise and becoming another frontier tragedy. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Between 1750 and 1900, frontier families developed comprehensive protection systems that combined early warning, physical barriers, defensive weapons, and tactical knowledge. These weren't simple precautions. They were sophisticated security systems that could protect families against multiple types of threats using only traditional materials and proven techniques. Perimeter defense and early warning systems, creating the first line of protection, 1750 to 1800. The key to frontier security was detecting threats before they reached the cabin, giving families time to prepare defenses and respond appropriately. Frontier families developed sophisticated early warning systems that could detect intruders, predators, and raiders in complete darkness using only natural materials and traditional techniques. The noise-making alarm systems used carefully placed objects that would create sounds when disturbed by intruders or animals. Dried gourds filled with pebbles were hung from trees and fence posts around the cabin perimeter, creating natural alarm bells that would rattle when touched. Tin cans and metal objects were strung on wire or rope to create noise barriers that would alert families to approaching threats. These systems were positioned to catch even careful intruders who might try to approach silently. The animal sentinel networks used domestic animals as living alarm systems that could detect threats long before humans could sense danger. Dogs were the primary early warning system, trained to bark at specific types of threats while remaining quiet during normal nighttime sounds. Geese were excellent sentries that would honk loudly at any unusual movement or unfamiliar presence. Even chickens and other livestock could serve as early warning systems when properly positioned and managed. The trip wire and snare systems created physical barriers that would slow intruders and alert families to their presence. Thin wires or strong cords were strung between trees and posts at ankle height, designed to trip intruders and create noise when disturbed. These systems were often combined with noise-making devices that would activate when the wires were triggered. The placement of trip wires required careful planning to avoid interfering with family movement while still catching intruders. The sightline management and clearing techniques created open areas around cabins that eliminated hiding places and forced potential threats to cross open ground where they could be seen and targeted. Trees and brush were cleared for 50 to 100 yards around cabins, creating kill zones where intruders would be exposed. Strategic placement of obstacles and barriers channeled potential attackers into predetermined areas where defenders had advantages. The watch rotation and guard duty systems ensured that someone was always alert and ready to respond to threats. Family members took turns staying awake and watching for danger, with specific assignments and responsibilities for each watch period. The watch systems included protocols for waking other family members, accessing weapons, and coordinating defensive responses. Effective watch systems required careful planning to ensure that guards remained alert and effective throughout the night. The signal and communication methods allowed families to alert neighbors and coordinate responses to major threats. Signal fires, horn calls, and other communication systems could summon help from neighboring families during serious emergencies. These communication networks were essential for dealing with threats that were too large for individual families to handle alone. The signals had to be distinctive and recognizable while not alerting potential attackers to defensive preparations. The camouflage and concealment techniques made cabins less visible to potential raiders and reduced the likelihood of being targeted. Cabins were often built in locations that were naturally concealed from main travel routes. Smoke from fires was managed to minimize visibility from a distance. Lights were carefully controlled to avoid attracting unwanted attention. The goal was to make homesteads appear unoccupied or unworthy of attack. The decoy and misdirection systems created false targets and confused potential attackers about the location and strength of defensive positions. Fake campfires and lights could draw attackers away from the actual cabin location. Decoy structures and false entrances could confuse raiders and give defenders tactical advantages. These psychological warfare techniques were often as effective as physical barriers in deterring attacks. The seasonal adaptation and weather considerations modified protection systems for different conditions and threats. Winter protection required different techniques than summer security, as snow could reveal tracks and movement patterns. Weather conditions affected the effectiveness of different alarm systems and required backup methods. Seasonal changes in animal behavior and vegetation also affected protection strategies. The threat assessment and intelligence gathering systems helped families understand the specific dangers in their area and adapt their protection accordingly. Information about raider activity, predator behavior, and other threats was gathered from travelers, neighbors, and personal observation. This intelligence was used to modify protection systems and prepare for specific types of attacks. Understanding the nature of local threats was essential for effective defense planning. The maintenance and testing protocols ensured that protection systems remained effective and reliable. Regular inspection and maintenance of alarm systems, barriers, and weapons was essential for continued protection. Testing procedures verified that all systems worked properly and that family members knew their roles and responsibilities. Neglected protection systems could fail at critical moments, leaving families vulnerable to attack. By 1800, frontier families had developed comprehensive early warning and perimeter defense systems that could detect and deter most threats before they reached the cabin. These systems formed the foundation of frontier security and provided the time and information needed for effective defensive responses. Physical barriers and fortification. Building impenetrable defenses, 1800 to 1850. Once threats were detected, physical barriers and fortifications provided the next line of defense, creating obstacles that could stop or delay attackers while protecting family members. Frontier families developed sophisticated barrier systems using only local materials and traditional construction techniques. The cabin construction and defensive architecture incorporated security features into the basic structure of frontier homes. Log cabins were built with thick walls that could stop bullets and resist attack by animals or raiders. Windows were small and positioned high on walls to prevent easy entry while still allowing defensive fire. Doors were reinforced with iron hardware and multiple locking mechanisms. The cabin design itself was the primary defensive barrier. The palisade and fence systems created secure perimeters around cabins and important areas like livestock pens and gardens. Wooden palisades made from sharpened logs could stop both human attackers and large predators. The logs were set deep in the ground and lashed together to create solid barriers. Gates and entrances were heavily reinforced and could be quickly secured during attacks. These perimeter barriers forced attackers to concentrate their efforts on specific points where defenders had advantages. The underground and hidden defenses provided protection that was invisible to attackers and could surprise raiders who thought they had overcome the main defenses. Root cellars and underground chambers could serve as hiding places and last resort defensive positions. Hidden tunnels could provide escape routes or allow defenders to attack from unexpected directions. These concealed defenses were often the difference between survival and death during serious attacks. The obstacle and barrier placement created defensive zones that channeled attackers into kill zones and prevented easy approach to the cabin. Fallen trees, ditches, and other obstacles were positioned to force attackers to move through areas where defenders had clear fields of fire. Thorny bushes and other natural barriers could slow attackers and cause injuries. The placement of obstacles required careful planning to create effective defensive zones. The water and supply protection systems ensured that families could survive extended sieges without leaving their defensive positions. Wells were often located inside palisades or connected to cabins by covered passages. Food storage areas were positioned to remain accessible during attacks. Water storage systems provided backup supplies that could sustain families during prolonged defensive actions. Control of water and food supplies was often decisive in determining the outcome of attacks. The livestock protection and management systems kept valuable animals safe while maintaining their usefulness for defense and survival. Livestock pens were positioned within defensive perimeters and could be quickly secured during attacks. Animals could serve as early warning systems and food sources during sieges. The protection of livestock was essential for long-term survival and economic security. Losing livestock to raiders or predators could doom a family to starvation. The workshop and tool security measures protected essential equipment and weapons from theft or destruction. Blacksmith shops, tool storage, and weapon caches were positioned within defensive perimeters and could be secured during attacks. The loss of tools and weapons could leave families defenseless and unable to maintain their homesteads. Secure storage systems protected these essential resources from raiders and weather. The fire prevention and suppression systems protected wooden structures from both accidental fires and fire attacks by raiders. Fire was one of the most dangerous threats to frontier families as it could destroy everything they had built. Fire suppression systems included water storage, sand buckets, and firefighting tools. Fire prevention measures included proper chimney construction, safe storage of flammable materials, and defensive positioning that reduced fire risks. The modular and expandable defense systems could be modified and improved as families grew and threats changed. Basic defensive systems could be expanded and strengthened over time as resources became available. Modular construction allowed families to add new defensive features without rebuilding entire systems. The ability to adapt and improve defenses was essential for long-term security and survival. The camouflage and concealment of defensive features made barriers less obvious to potential attackers and preserved tactical advantages. Defensive positions were often disguised to appear less formidable than they actually were, encouraging attackers to underestimate the defensive capabilities. Concealed firing positions and hidden barriers could surprise attackers and provide decisive advantages. The psychological impact of hidden defenses often deterred attacks before they began. The maintenance and repair protocols ensured that defensive barriers remained effective despite weather, wear, and potential damage from previous attacks. Regular inspection and maintenance of walls, fences, and other barriers was essential for continued protection. Repair procedures had to be quick and effective, as damaged defenses could be exploited by attackers. Preventive maintenance was much easier and more effective than emergency repairs during attacks. By 1850, frontier families had developed comprehensive barrier and fortification systems that could protect against most types of attacks using only traditional materials and construction techniques. These physical defenses provided the foundation for family security and created safe zones where families could survive even the most determined attacks. Weapons and Combat Readiness, Preparing for the Final Stand, 1850 to 1875. When early warning systems and physical barriers failed to stop threats, frontier families had to rely on weapons and combat skills to protect their lives and property. Frontier families developed comprehensive weapons systems and combat techniques that could defeat both human attackers and dangerous predators. The firearm selection and maintenance systems ensured that families had reliable weapons that could stop any threat they might face. Rifles were the primary defensive weapons, chosen for their accuracy and stopping power at long range. Shotguns provided devastating close-range firepower that could stop multiple attackers or large predators. Pistols served as backup weapons and close-quarters defensive tools. Proper maintenance and care of firearms was essential for reliability during critical moments. The ammunition management and supply systems provided adequate firepower for extended defensive actions while conserving precious resources. Ammunition was expensive and difficult to obtain on the frontier, so careful management was essential. Families learned to reload their own ammunition and cast their own bullets to maintain adequate supplies. Emergency ammunition caches were hidden in multiple locations to ensure that weapons remained useful even if primary supplies were captured or destroyed. The weapon positioning and deployment strategies placed firearms where they could be most effective during defensive actions. Weapons were positioned at windows, doors, and other defensive positions where they could cover approaches to the cabin. Multiple weapons were often positioned at each defensive point to provide continuous fire. Quick access to weapons was essential, as attacks could develop rapidly and without warning. The marksmanship and combat training ensured that all family members could use weapons effectively under stress. Regular practice with firearms was essential for developing the skills needed for accurate shooting during combat. Training included shooting at different ranges, in different lighting conditions, and under simulated stress. Even children were taught basic weapon handling and marksmanship skills that could save their lives during attacks. The close-quarters combat and hand-to-hand fighting techniques provided last-resort defensive capabilities when firearms were not available or effective. Knives, axes, and other edged weapons could be deadly in close combat. Hand-to-hand fighting skills were essential for situations where firearms were not practical or available. These skills were often the difference between life and death during surprise attacks or when ammunition ran out. The tactical coordination and family teamwork systems ensured that defensive efforts were coordinated and effective. Each family member had specific roles and responsibilities during defensive actions. Communication systems allowed coordination of defensive fire and movement. Teamwork was essential for effective defense, as individual efforts were rarely sufficient against determined attackers. The psychological warfare and intimidation techniques could deter attacks and reduce the likelihood of violence. Displays of defensive capability and determination could convince potential attackers to seek easier targets. Reputation for effective defense could protect families by discouraging attacks before they began. The psychological aspects of defense were often as important as physical capabilities. The emergency response and crisis management protocols provided structured responses to different types of threats and attacks. Different threats required different defensive responses, and families needed clear procedures for each situation. Emergency procedures included evacuation plans, communication protocols, and coordination with neighbors. Effective crisis management could prevent panic and ensure that defensive efforts were coordinated and effective. The weapon concealment and security measures protected firearms from theft while keeping them accessible for defensive use. Weapons had to be secured against theft by raiders while remaining quickly accessible during emergencies. Hidden weapon caches provided backup armaments that could be accessed if primary weapons were lost or captured. The security of weapons was essential for maintaining defensive capabilities. The medical and first aid preparations provided treatment for injuries sustained during defensive actions. Combat injuries required immediate treatment to prevent death or permanent disability. Medical supplies and knowledge were essential for treating gunshot wounds, cuts, and other injuries. The ability to treat injuries could determine whether defensive actions were successful or resulted in family casualties. The post-combat procedures and recovery protocols helped families deal with the aftermath of defensive actions and prepare for potential follow-up attacks. After successful defense, families needed to assess damage, treat injuries, and prepare for possible revenge attacks. Recovery procedures included repairing defenses, restocking supplies, and coordinating with neighbors. The period after an attack was often as dangerous as the attack itself. By 1875, frontier families had developed comprehensive weapons and combat systems that could defeat most threats using traditional firearms and fighting techniques. These combat capabilities provided the final line of defense and ensured that families could protect themselves even when all other defensive measures failed. Psychological defense and community networks. Building unbreakable security, 1875 to 1900. The most effective frontier protection systems combined physical defenses with psychological strategies and community cooperation that created security networks stronger than any individual family could achieve alone. Frontier families developed sophisticated social and psychological defense systems that deterred attacks and provided mutual protection. The reputation management and deterrent strategies created psychological barriers that prevented attacks by establishing reputations for effective defense and dangerous retaliation. Families that successfully defended against attacks gained reputations that deterred future threats. Stories of effective defense spread throughout frontier communities and discouraged potential attackers. The psychological impact of a strong defensive reputation was often more effective than physical barriers in preventing attacks. The community cooperation and mutual aid networks created defensive alliances that could respond to threats that were too large for individual families to handle. Neighboring families formed mutual defense agreements that provided coordinated responses to major threats. Signal systems allowed rapid communication of threats and coordination of defensive responses. Community cooperation multiplied the defensive capabilities of individual families and created security networks that covered entire regions. The intelligence gathering and threat assessment systems provided early warning of potential attacks and allowed families to prepare appropriate defenses. Information networks tracked the movement of potential threats and provided advance warning of danger. Travelers, traders, and other visitors provided intelligence about conditions in surrounding areas. This information was essential for understanding threats and preparing effective defenses. The deception and misdirection techniques confused potential attackers about defensive capabilities and made families appear to be more difficult targets than they actually were. False defensive positions and decoy structures could mislead attackers about the location and strength of defenses. Misinformation about defensive capabilities could deter attacks by making families appear more dangerous than they were. These psychological warfare techniques were often as effective as physical defenses. The negotiation and conflict resolution skills provided alternatives to violence that could resolve disputes without bloodshed. Many potential conflicts could be resolved through negotiation and compromise rather than violence. Diplomatic skills were essential for dealing with hostile neighbors, raiders, and other threats. The ability to avoid violence through negotiation was often more effective than defensive preparations. The economic and trade relationships created incentives for peaceful behavior and reduced the likelihood of attacks. Trading relationships with neighbors and travelers created economic incentives for peaceful behavior. Families that were valuable trading partners were less likely to be attacked. Economic relationships could provide protection that was more reliable than physical defenses. The cultural and social integration strategies helped families become accepted members of frontier communities and reduced the likelihood of being targeted by local threats. Families that were well integrated into local communities were less likely to be attacked by neighbors or local raiders. Social relationships provided protection and support that individual families could not achieve alone. Cultural integration was essential for long-term security and survival. The legal and justice systems provided formal mechanisms for resolving disputes and punishing attackers. Even on the frontier, legal systems provided some protection against violence and theft. Formal justice systems could deter attacks by providing consequences for criminal behavior. The development of legal institutions was essential for creating stable, secure communities. The education and knowledge transfer systems ensured that defensive knowledge and skills were passed down through generations and shared within communities. The knowledge of defensive techniques, threat assessment, and security planning was essential for community survival. Educational systems preserved and transmitted this knowledge to ensure that communities remained capable of defending themselves. Knowledge sharing improved the defensive capabilities of entire communities. The adaptation and evolution of defensive systems allowed communities to respond to changing threats and improve their security over time. Defensive systems had to evolve as threats changed and new challenges emerged. The ability to adapt and improve defensive capabilities was essential for long-term survival. Communities that could not adapt to changing conditions often failed to survive. The leadership and organization systems provided coordination and direction for community defensive efforts. Effective leadership was essential for organizing defensive responses and coordinating community efforts. Leadership systems had to be flexible enough to respond to different types of threats while maintaining community cohesion. Good leadership could make the difference between successful defense and community destruction. Security was never about the strength of your walls, wrote frontier chronicler Samuel Mackenzie in 1887. It was about the strength of your community, the wisdom of your preparations, and the determination of your family to survive whatever the darkness brought. A family that prepared well and worked with their neighbors could sleep peacefully, even in the most dangerous territory. A family that tried to stand alone rarely saw many sunrises. The techniques we've explored in videos like how frontier families survived weeks without food or fire and how frontiersmen built survival tools from nothing demonstrate that frontier families developed complete security systems using only traditional methods and community cooperation. The protection capabilities developed by frontier families prove that with proper planning, community cooperation, and traditional defensive techniques, it's possible to create security that surpasses many modern alternatives. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America.